when you're a historian, you take what facts there are and you try to line them up, and they'll never always line up because there's all kinds of holes in everything. But you certainly don't want to start from arguing from a position of what you want to have happened.
I'm joined today by Brother Gerrit Dirkmaat of the Joseph Smith Papers. He has a PhD in history. He's worked with the Joseph Smith Papers since 2010. He was a co-editor on the Documents Volume 1 and the lead editor of Documents Volume 3. He's an associate professor of church history and doctrine at BYU, and he also has been working on the Brigham Young Journals, as well as the new book out by Deseret Book. Let's talk about the Book of Mormon translation. And he is also the co-author of this book here, From Darkness Unto Light, also about the Book of Mormon translation. So thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank you for
Gerrit.
having me.
It is absolutely a pleasure. All right, so today we are talking about Joseph Smith's seer stones. The claim is that Joseph Smith used a personal seer stone during the Book of Mormon translation. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, it's a very broad question, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think first and foremost, it's good to settle ourselves in what is Joseph telling us about the translation of the Book of Mormon from the very beginning. From the very beginning, the angel who appears to him tells him that there are special stones that have been prepared for the purpose of translating ancient languages, and that those stones have been buried and hidden up with the plates. And so before Joseph has the plates, before Joseph sees the plates, one of the first instructions he receives is that he is going to be using in some way these sacred special stones in order to translate. Now, we will generally in the church use the biblical term Urim and Thummim to describe the stones that were found in the box with the plates. The way they're described is they're bound together in a kind of figure eight. And we often, I know I always assumed that, well, it's Urim and Thummim and there's two stones. So maybe this one's named Urim and I guess this one's named Thummim, and that appellation, that nomenclature is something that actually kind of develops a little bit later. And so I think it's the first thing is important to understand is that when Joseph is using the term Urim and Thummim, he's clearly applying it to other stones that aren't just the stones that are found in the box. So when someone says, well, wait a minute, I thought he did it by the Urim and Thummim. Well, he certainly did, but Joseph's also using the word Urim and Thummim to mean any sacred seer stone. This is something that members of the church know, they just don't know that they know it, right? Because if I were to ask you, what is this world going to be like in its glorified, sanctified, and immortal state, you would say, oh, it'll be like a giant
Urim and Thummim.
You mean the ones Joseph had in the box? Well, obviously not, right? So obviously Joseph is using it, what is everyone going to have when they go to the celestial kingdom? Their own Urim and Thummim. Obviously by the end of Joseph's life, he's using the term Urim and Thummim as a general way of describing a seer stone, a sacred holy seer stone. And I think, historians have really kind of keyed on why they make that distinction. The first is that originally, when the story of the translation of the Book of Mormon came out, there were, of course, detractors. Now, this is going to be a surprise to you, Sarah, but apparently there are people who have a hard time with the Book of Mormon and its translation. And it's a very shocking thing that there are detractors, almost like an angel had said that his name would be had for good and evil among all nations. But and so early on, people began to mock and make fun of not just the book itself, not just the claim that Joseph saw an angel, but they also started to make fun of the way he said it was translated. And the way that these early witnesses and the way the reports was that Joseph had used these stones in order to translate. Well, you get the first major anti-Mormon book that's ever published in 1834, Mormonism Unveiled, tries to really push this point, making a mockery of the fact that he cleansed their stones and he put a stone in a hat. Can anyone possibly believe this? And sometimes that the very fact that antagonists are mocking how things occurred in the past can make us feel uncomfortable, because they're making a mockery of the stone and how you place it in a hat. How could anyone possibly believe this? Well, we have to be careful to not allow the mockery of non-believers to affect our understanding of events as they occurred. And you can see this in early Christian history. I mean, the Romans mocked the ordinance of the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. They made pejoratives out of it, claiming that the Christians were actually eating real babies. Right. They claimed that it was actual murders that were. Of course, that wasn't what was going on. But think of where we would be as Christians if we said, well, the ordinance of the sacrament of the Lord's Supper is completely false. It never came from Jesus, because the first people who are writing about it are writing these pejorative, evil things about it. Okay. And so I think that's an important thing to understand, is that early on, people are making fun of, attacking, mocking the Book of Mormon and how people said it was translated. And so I think there was a very conscious decision that was made. In 1833, the church's newspaper publishes an article in which it says the book was translated by the means of spectacles, which is how Joseph describes those stones found in the box, bound together as spectacles, or what might have been called teraphim or Urim and Thummim. And you first get this introduction of this biblical term, and I can see exactly why they do it. What was the Urim and Thummim in the Bible? Well, you got all kinds of Bible scholars who argue about what it actually was. But that there was something, that there were stones that in some way aided the high priest. And you have all kinds of different descriptions. People say, well, maybe it was a yes or a no thing, or whatever the way they were used. Urim and Thummim stones in the Bible were sacred. They were from God. They weren't things that were just, someone picked up on a street corner. The whole point of using that terminology was to signal to the mockers and to the disbelievers, these are sacred stones. These are from God. And so, to your original question that I took far too long to answer, we have dozens of separate accounts of people who are either close associates with Joseph, scribes of the translation, witnesses of the translation, who all state that Joseph uses multiple different translation devices in the form of stones. President Brigham Young, in April 17th of 1853, is giving, he's doing a kind of a Q&A session with mainly some of the apostles. This is kept in the General Church Minutes. And he states pretty categorically that Joseph had 3 seer stones, that he had 2 small ones and 1 large one. And those are the ones that Emma saw. So that Joseph had more than the stones found in the box is not only something that's well known to early members of the church. The president of the church succeeding Joseph is going to, in a question and answer session about the translation, categorically state that Joseph has more than 1 seer stone. For modern Latter-day Saints, who, like myself, just grew up hearing the word Urim and Thummim. Right. And frankly, I never really thought about the translation a whole lot. Probably not a very good way to sell a book on the translation. But when I was a kid, I didn't think about it. I knew that it was by the gift and power of God. I never really thought about how the stones worked or how that miracle took place. And so for modern Latter-day Saints, they often think, well, all I've ever heard about is the Urim and Thummim. And yet, what are the Urim and Thummim stones? According to the angel, they are sacred stones that God prepared for the translation of ancient languages. When it comes to which stones did Joseph have, how many did he have, it becomes a little bit more difficult. Unfortunately, one of the rough parts about being a historian is people from the past don't always give you the details you want them to give you. No. It's very frustrating. If you could go back in time, you could just say, hey, I need you to tell me what color that stone is. But from various different sources, we have an understanding that Joseph has at least one, most likely two other stones. And let me explain that a little bit. Wilford Woodruff is going to explain that Joseph Smith is shown by revelation where the seer stone Gazelum is. This is the stone that's mentioned in Alma in the Book of Mormon. It's a separate stone. It's a with this name, right? That is mentioned in the Book of Mormon that will help bring these things to light. Wilford Woodruff will say that Joseph is shown by revelation where that stone is, some 30 feet under the earth, and that he says that he will obtain under the pretense of digging for a well. That's at least how he understands it. There's also another description of Joseph getting a stone under a tree, 15 feet under the earth, found inside of a kettle, near the banks of Lake Erie. Because you don't have good definitive descriptions from the time period on what's going on at each stage, it becomes more difficult to know which stone he's using. But what's important to know is multiple witnesses of translation talk about Joseph Smith using both the stones that were found with the gold plates, what we often refer to as the Urim or interpreters, however we want to talk to them, and a separate stone that he will use. Emma Smith will draw a pretty clear distinction. She'll say that the first part that Joseph translated, the part that she was the scribe for, the part that Martin Harris lost, she reminds everyone. I always feel, Emma was a scribe for this massive portion of the Book of Mormon, and we just
is gone.
we just don't value her contribution because Martin Harris. Now, I don't want to say lost it. Someone stole it from him. It's not like Martin Harris it's not like he put it in his briefcase and couldn't find it later. I mean, he didn't know where he parked his car. Someone stole them. That's what the Lord tells us. She says that he uses the two stones bound together at first. And then after that uses a small stone that's not exactly black, but is rather dark in color, which is sometimes referred to as a brown stone.
Okay.
We have multiple accounts of that brown stone. And it is a stone that apparently is going to end up back in the possession of the church later. Joseph, after he's done with the translation of the Book of Mormon, is going to give that brown stone to Oliver Cowdery.
Okay.
Now, why he gives it to Oliver Cowdery, I don't know. Joseph doesn't give a soliloquy saying, I'm giving this to you, Oliver, because of, we just don't know.
Okay.
Oliver then has that stone. And as we are all well aware, Oliver Cowdery will later apostatize. And so the assumption is he still has that brown stone in his years of apostasy.
Okay.
He will later come back to the church, spoiler alert for everybody. He comes back to the church but almost immediately after he comes back to the church, he's going to pass away. Not immediately, but pretty quickly thereafter. He'll die in Missouri at his brother-in-law's house. David Whitmer's his brother-in-law. He's married to David Whitmer's sister. And Phineas Young will go out there to visit Oliver's widow and will get this brown stone from her and bring it back to Utah. So that brown stone has been in Utah since the 1850s and is believed to be the stone that Joseph used for part of the translation.
Okay.
There's also accounts of another stone, a white stone, that Joseph also apparently uses for the translation. And certainly has in his possession even after the translation is over. I think, again, most Latter-day Saints assume, well, the only reason why Joseph had these seer stones was to translate the Book of Mormon. And so as soon as the Book of Mormon was done, that's it. We're out. Well, we no longer need these stones. But the historical record suggests that Joseph continues to use seer stones on occasion. And frankly, we don't really know how occasionally he uses them. Joseph doesn't have a daily journal where he says, today I looked at a seer stone. He doesn't. Right. But we do have anecdotal accounts of various times in which Joseph is at least reported to have used a seer stone. One of the really good early examples of Joseph still using a seer stone, even after he's apparently given that brown stone to Oliver Cowdery, is for Doctrine and Covenants section 34.
Oh,
This
okay.
is the revelation that's given to Orson Pratt. It's the revelation sending Orson Pratt on his mission. And so it's Orson Pratt in a later interview who explains how this revelation was given to him. And this is in 1830. So the Book of Mormon's already been published. The church has already been established, and we're getting ready to, now we're sending Orson Pratt off on a mission. And the way he describes it is that Joseph, they go into a room. Joseph produces a stone. He places it into a hat and asks Orson if he'll write, while Joseph dictates the revelation. And Orson says, well, I didn't feel like I was worthy to do that. So they got someone else to do it, and he dictates the revelation. And so that's Joseph receiving a revelation via means of that seer stone, even after the Book of Mormon is completed.
Okay.
So we also have other accounts. I mean, Edward Stevenson is going to talk about how Joseph will borrow a book from his mother, Fox's Book of the Martyrs, and Joseph will return the book, and in returning it, say that he saw through the seer stones, through the Urim and Thummim, because again, he's calling every seer stone Urim and Thummim, that, that these martyrs were good people and stuff. And that's, would have to have been in like 1834, 35.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have in 1841 in Wilford Woodruff's journal, Wilford Woodruff describing how Joseph shows him he again calls it Urim and Thummim because that's what Joseph was calling it, shows him that stone. So you have multiple different accounts of Joseph having seer stones in his life long after he is supposed to have given back the original interpreter stones that were found with the gold plates. Again, Brigham Young in his April 1853 discussion says specifically that the Urim and Thummim stones, the ones found with the plates, that they were given back to the angel.
Okay.
Yes, it's an area of Latter-day Saint history that I think makes some people feel uncomfortable because they don't really know about it. Mm-hmm. But there really shouldn't be that much difference in Joseph having a separate seer stone and using it to either translate or receive revelation, and Joseph having the two seer stones found with the plates and using it to either translate or receive revelation. Either way, there's a miracle that's taking place.
Okay. So, well, first of all, going along with the conversation about Joseph using those other stones, what do you think about the reports like by Parley Pratt or Lucy Mack Smith that he used a seer stone during the Book of Abraham translation?
Well, so we have, unfortunately, again, a very, very, I mean, as little as we know about how the translation of the Book of Mormon took place, we know even less about the Bible translation, and we know even less about the Book of Abraham translation.
Okay.
And so all you get is some anecdotal things. Wilford Woodruff, again in his journal. So Wilford Woodruff is going to see the seer stone, which we assume to be the white seer stone, because again, Oliver Cowdery's out of the church and he's got the brown seer stone. So probably. Again, unfortunately, Wilford Woodruff doesn't describe it. He doesn't say, let me tell you exactly what it looked like. But a couple months after that, Wilford is going to write in his journal that pretty exultantly that God is allowing Joseph, through the means of the Urim and Thummim, to translate records which are as old as Abraham or as Adam.
Oh, wow.
Now, so at least Wilford Woodruff believes that the seer stone is in some way involved in that translation. Now, that Joseph attempts to try to work things out in a kind of secular translation in Kirtland, there seems to be pretty good evidence of that he's trying to figure out how to do it. But we just don't have, daily accounts of how he's translating. Mm-hmm. And, it's kind of the same way with the Book of Mormon. I don't know what it takes to translate an ancient record by the gift and power of God. It will come as a surprise to many of your viewers, but I'm not a prophet and I don't have any special keys, so I don't actually know. Oftentimes people will say things like, well, I mean, don't you think Joseph Smith would have done it like this? I have no idea. I mean, I don't know what it takes to be a seer. So when someone says, well, I'm sure Joseph should have just done it this way or done it this way, what are we basing this off of? We're basing it off of what we assume would be the case. And Joseph has those gold plates for months before he starts translating. They're copying characters off of them. It seems like he's trying to make an alphabet according to Lucy,
Yeah.
All of that might have been essential in order to be able to translate through the use of the seer stones. Maybe that's part of the reason why Oliver Cowdery wasn't able to translate, is that it took more than just, hey, here's the sacred stone and have at it. Maybe it took more preparation. I don't really know. And at the same time, it is at least something that Wilford Woodruff believes, that Joseph's using the Urim and Thummim in order to translate the Book of Abraham. Now, you'll find a lot of people say, no, I don't think that he was.
Okay.
I don't think there's a way to know definitively. What is definitive is Joseph believes the Book of Abraham is the Word of God, right? He believes this is actually from God. And how those words are translated, I think it's a great question. I mean, the reality is Doctrine and Covenants section 7 demonstrates to us that through the means of seer stones, which D&C 7 directly says Joseph used the Urim and Thummim to translate. That's what it says in Joseph Smith history. Joseph's able to receive translations even of works that aren't in front of him. Joseph says that Doctrine and Covenants section 7 is a translation of a parchment written and hidden up by the Apostle John himself. Well, Joseph didn't stop the translation of the Book of Mormon, take a quick trip to the Holy Land, dig around in a few caves, find the parchment, come back and say, okay. He apparently doesn't have it in front of him at all, but still receives the words of that translation on those stones.
Okay.
And that appears to be, at least it's the way that most witnesses and scribes of the translation talk about the usage of the stones. That to use them, Joseph would, and at least usually, try to place them in a place to make it darker around the stone. Usually, the method they use is a hat. I mean, if you think about it, if you need to make the area around the stone dark so you can see what's on it, you have a couple of options. You can either make the room really dark, in which case it's very difficult to write.
Right.
It's a pretty difficult job for Oliver to write down if he can't see anything. Or you can try to make the area around the stone dark so you can see what is apparently appearing on it. And that seems to be the method that they use.
So would you say that's kind of like, when you're trying to look at your cell phone in a bright day, you have to kind of shield it to... Absolutely.
In fact, I think, Elder Uchtdorf uses that exact analogy on his Facebook post that he made about the translation and the seer stones. I mean, all of us understand that principle. If you have something being projected on a wall in a really bright room, you can't see it. And by turning the lights off, you suddenly can. Well, what was being projected didn't change at all. All that changed was the ambient light around it. And so, at least according to Alma, talking about the seer stone Gazelum, that it says, that it will shine forth in darkness unto light. So it shouldn't be terribly surprising that if, in fact, the way these sacred stones functioned is they were placed in the darkness and then you could see the words that appeared on them. That's what David Whitmer says happens. It's what Martin Harris says happened. It's certainly how Joseph Knight, Joseph's good friend, believes happened. He says, that one character at a time would appear. In fact, Joseph Knight's account is really it's a great one, because he says that Joseph would put the stone in his hat and darken his eyes so he could see what's on it, and that the words would appear of the translation, and Joseph would read them off. And then the reason why it's a great source is that Joseph Knight says, but if it was not spelt right, and so it's spelt with a T, it's spelt and then right, R-I-T-E is how he writes it. So if it was not spelt right, it would not go away until it was right. And you're thinking, well, I have no idea of knowing how Joseph Knight would know that it was spelled right or not, but that you at least have multiple people who give this account of it. That Joseph would place either the two stones bound together or a separate stone into the hat in order to block out the light. Again, it's not a magic hat. Okay. This isn't Frosty the Snowman's hat. You don't put it on his head and he begins to dance around. It's a tool. Just like the pen they're writing with is a tool. Just like the table is a tool. The point is to make it so you can readily and easily see the miracle of the translation through the stones. And I think that's something people need to remember, is that early Latter-day Saints, they aren't like us trying to find a way to believe in spite of the fact that Joseph Smith used seer stones. They're really the exact opposite. They believe because Joseph Smith is miraculously receiving these words somehow completely beyond himself. These words are appearing. And when David Whitmer talks about the translation, that's what he says. When Joseph Knight talks about it, he says, so we see it was marvelous. So I think it's important not to lose sight of this, that however odd the miracle might seem to us, the people who were present for it, the people who knew about it the most, they're the ones who are certain it's a miracle. People after the fact who are trying to make things work out in their head, it troubles them. Didn't trouble the people who were there for it. The people who were there for it are the ones who are certain that it's this marvelous work and a wonder from God.
I think that is a wonderful point. And going along with that, what do you say to critics who, or even believing members of the church who have questions about, for example, in the Book of Mormon, it does talk pretty heavily about the interpreters being set apart for the translation. Yeah. So a lot of people will say, those were set apart. I think Joseph Fielding Smith said this specifically, like those were set apart for the Urim and Thummim. So why on earth would Joseph use other stones?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question that at the same time, the same Book of Mormon also references another single stone, which it gives a name to. So look, if we're just using the Book of Mormon and just the Book of Mormon and that's it, well, what do we know? We know that there are multiple translation devices in the Book of Mormon that are mentioned. For instance, the brother of Gerrit, right? These two stones you will seal up with them so that the people who find those plates can interpret them. So we know that the brother of Gerrit, and that's early. Okay. So early on, we have God setting aside two stones for the translation of ancient languages. We then can move forward, in time. We get to Mosiah when Ammon, not chop everyone's arms off, Ammon, but I'm not worthy to baptize you, Ammon.
Right.
Ammon the Lesser, just because it's more fun, the arm chopping incident. But when Ammon finds the people of Limhi, and Limhi realizes that he's from Zarahemla, that question that he asked, because they found those Jaredite plates, is, knowest thou of anyone who can translate? And he tells him about these plates. And the response from Ammon is, I can assuredly tell thee, O king, a man who can translate ancient records, for he has wherewith he can look and translate records which are of ancient date, and it is a gift from God. Now, King Mosiah clearly already has something that he can use to translate. It's not what Limhi's people have found with the Jaredite gold plates, because they didn't know those existed. Now, maybe there is some kind of convoluted way in which the people of Zarahemla did find the Jaredite seer stones. It's just not in the Book of Mormon. I mean, there's always the possibility that something occurred that's not in the Book of Mormon, but at least according to what we have in the Book of Mormon, they appear to be separate. There appears to be a separate translation device that Mosiah has, that he's already been using, that even before they know that there's Jaredite plates, that he can use to translate. And how does he translate? He looks at them. He looks at those stones. So it's not a passive thing. You don't just have the stone and you put it in your pocket. And it's clearly something that's prepared. And then and that you interact with. And then you have in Alma 37 this reference to a separate single stone. Well, I mean, at the very least, you have to say that there are at least the two Jaredite stones that are prepared and a separate stone named Gaslam. And by the way, Brigham Young, the prophet, is also saying that Joseph had 3 seer stones. So when someone says, well, no, there's no possible way that he had more, well, I'm not entirely sure why. Because the Book of Mormon itself says that there's at least the Gerritite stones and Gazelum, which is that's 3. That's 3 stones right there. It would be a very logical conclusion to say there's probably more. In fact, not only is there probably more, what do we get from the Book of Abraham? We get that he has a Urim and Thummim as well, right? And so clearly this is how God has decided that he's going to both give revelation to his prophets and have them translate ancient languages is through the sometimes employment of stones. Now, someone might say, well, don't you think, couldn't God have given Joseph Smith those revelations without the seer stones? Well, whenever you're saying the word couldn't God, the answer is always yes. I mean, yeah, of course. Could Jesus have healed the blind man without putting clay on his eyes? I think every Christian would say, of course he could. So why did Jesus do it? Now, we can speculate all day long about why Jesus did it. Oh, it was to increase the faith of the blind man. Oh, it was to demonstrate to people what was going on. Oh, all of those are speculations. What is the reality? The reality is our Savior used a physical object as part of a miracle that he clearly could have performed otherwise. Okay. So I don't know why God designed the translation of the gold plates or other ancient languages, or with Abraham, or with the brother of Gerrit, or with Messiah, why God decided to use the means of sacred stones that he prepared, but it's clearly what God is doing. And so I would say that, yes, those stones were prepared for the translation, and Joseph clearly uses them. And there was apparently other stones that were prepared for the translation, and Joseph clearly uses them. If the question is, could God have given Joseph Smith the translation of the Book of Mormon in another means? The answer has to be yes, because it's God. So we're really just kind of left with, what does the historical record say? What do we think is going on with David Whitmer and Martin Harris and Joseph Knight and Emma Smith? Are they all just lying then? I mean, frankly, if you try to break down the arguments when people say, well, no, that's not how Joseph translated. Well, why are they all saying the same thing in multiple independent sources? And sure, we can point to the fact that, well, some of them apostatized, so therefore they're just liars. Right. Okay, they apostatized, but is Emma trying to besmirch Joseph when she says he used a seer stone? She's not, right? She desperately believes the Book of Mormon's true. She desperately believes that Joseph was a prophet. And so instead of saying how he actually translated, she decided, you know what? I'm not going to say how it happened. I'm just going to copy what a bunch of anti-Mormons said and say that instead. Same thing with David Whitmer. Same thing with Joseph Knight, who, by the way, didn't apostatize. But you know what? I'm not going to say how it actually happened. I'm just going to quote Mormonism Unveiled, because that's how I really think it happened. I mean, the reality is you have multiple independent attestation from multiple independent witnesses. All of their understanding is that Joseph used stones to translate. It's kind of a disingenuous thing, certainly not a scholarly thing, to use these sources, these exact same interviews, by the way, as we tout the fact that Joseph didn't know how to write a carefully worded letter, that Joseph didn't know that there were walls around Jerusalem. And yet at the same time say, in that same interview or in that same letter, the part where it's talking about the seer stone is a lie. The part where, that he didn't know that there were walls around Jerusalem, well, that was true. But the other part, I mean, the reality is you have multiple independent sources. In fact, our earliest source on translation, the very earliest written source that exists, is an antagonistic source. Now, the best part about early antagonistic anti-Mormonism this is from 1829.
Mhm.
In 1829, nobody knows there's going to be a church. Everyone who's even heard about the Gold Bible, they make fun of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a grand total of like 3 people who believe Joseph, and one of them's Martin Harris. You know, I mean, so like there is no great following. There's no fear that this is going to become a worldwide religion. There isn't even a church. And so, you know, why would I need to make up or manipulate the source? And this comes from a Palmyra publisher. His name's Jonathan Hadley. He publishes the other newspaper in town, and he is approached by Joseph and Martin Harris to publish the Book of Mormon. Because if we know our Book of Mormon publication history, they go to Egbert Grandin, but Egbert Grandin at first tells him, not on your life. No, I will not do this. And in fact, according to his brother-in-law, I don't know how great a source Pomeroy Tucker is, but according to his brother-in-law, not only does Grandin say, no, I'm not going to help you, he actually tries to get other residents of Palmyra to stop Martin Harris from doing it. So Grandin's like an active antagonist at the very beginning. So they go to the other printer in town, Jonathan Hadley. Well, Hadley, you know, he talks a good game in his paper. I can publish anything and I can do it cheaper and da-da-da-da. But when they come to him and we're going to publish 5,000 copies of a 600-page book, he's like, I meant like wedding invitations. I mean, I don't know what he says.
Right.
But what he does do is he says, I can't do this, but you know who can? The master I apprenticed under in Rochester, Thurlow Weed. And so they go to Thurlow Weed. Weed's like, yeah, I don't do books. They find another printer up in Rochester. And with that other printer, they now come back down to Grandin. Because Grandin could do it. He just wouldn't do it.
Okay.
So they come back down to Grandin and they say to Grandin, look, we're going to publish this in Rochester with Elihu Marshall if we have to, or we'll publish it here. We want to publish it here. And so Grandin relents, sees that they're going to, you know, waste their money either way, and agrees to publish it. But when Hadley, our other newspaper editor in Palmyra, when he finds out that it's not his buddy that's getting this windfall of $3,000, but it's his political and economic rival and antagonist in town. I mean, these two papers are constantly attacking each other. When he finds out that it's Grandin, he writes the earliest account we have of both the finding of the plates and the translation. And it's incredibly laden with sarcasm, but it's also super accurate.
Really?
He talks about how, you know, it's funny, all throughout the article, he'll like stop and make little parentheticals like, this is what he said anyway, because he doesn't want anyone to think that he believes this. So this is from August of 1829. So before even the first word of the Book of Mormon is typeset, Hadley's publishing this article, the Gold Bible. And he talks all about how Joseph Smith has visited 3 times in one night and told that in a certain hill by his home that there's a record of divine nature and origin and that it's written in hieroglyphics. He knows all about it. He actually knows the dimensions of the plates. Now, we got all kinds of people who are trying to give dimensions of the plates. But Hadley says it is said that the plates were written on leaves of gold, and they were 6 inches by 8 inches, exactly the dimensions Joseph gives. And he says, and in fact, this is one of these places he puts a parenthetical in there. He says that Joseph could, by placing the spectacles into his hat and looking into it, he said so at least, translate these characters. He's very, very concerned. He doesn't want to do it.
Right.
He goes on to tell the whole story of Martin Harris taking the characters to Samuel Mitchell in the East. He doesn't mention Anthony because Mitchell's a much bigger deal back then.
Okay.
And so this is an 1829 account. He actually can't steal this from anyone else. There is no other newspaper that's published this. We know that Joseph had a conversation with him. We know that Martin Harris is trying to get him to publish the Book of Mormon, and he's describing the way the Book of Mormon was translated was through the use of sacred stones, and that Joseph would place them in his hat in order to do it. So our very earliest account and all of our later witness accounts happen to all be the same. So for someone who wants to reject the idea that that's how it happened, that's the question you have to answer. Why would Joseph Knight, instead of telling the truth, just copy an anti-Mormon article from 1829? Why would Emma do that? Why would Oliver also describes Joseph translating by placing the stone in a hat? It's a relatively recent find. A non-Latter-day Saint historian found in a Shaker journal in 1830. So Oliver Cowdery gets sent on his mission to preach to the Lamanites. On his way, he preaches through Ohio. We know all about Sidney Rigdon getting converted by that. But on his way further across Ohio, he stops at a Shaker village to preach, and one of the Shaker elders there keeps in his journal an account of this and makes a mention that Joseph has stones and that he would place them into his hat in order to translate. Now, again, that's an independent source from 1830. Someone could say, well, maybe the Shaker had actually read it in a newspaper and that's the reason why he wrote it. Okay, I guess, but that's not what he wrote in his journal. He said, Oliver Cowdery's here, and he says Joseph Smith put a stone in his hat, and that's how he's able to translate. I mean, I think when you're a historian, you take what facts there are and you try to line them up, and they'll never always line up because there's all kinds of holes in everything. But you certainly don't want to start from arguing from a position of what you want to have happened. Right? What do I want to believe? Well, I want to believe that he just used the stones that were in the box and that was it, and there was nothing else that he used. Well, why do I want to believe that? I mean, if Mosiah had stones that were different than the brother of Gerrit's, does that make Mosiah not really a prophet? I mean, if Abraham had different stones than the ones that were given the brother of Gerrit, does that somehow make it not from God? I think, in fairness to people who are doing church history, before our time, we have vastly more sources and resources than they did. So, I mean, when someone says, well, yeah, but I read this publication from, the 1940s and it doesn't mention it. Well, yeah, two of the sources I mentioned weren't discovered then. So it's unfair to ask someone to know something before they know it. Of course they don't know it before they know it. When I was working on the Joseph Smith papers, that was the first time that the Council of 15 Minutes were made public to historians. Well, we all knew the Council of 50 existed, and we all knew the Council of 15 Minutes existed. They just weren't accessible. So as a historian working in that field, you kind of had to make all kinds of guesses. And I hate to break it to everybody, I guessed wrong a lot. I mean, there's a reason why I'm not gambling. I mean, I made some, informed summaries and educated guesses. But when I got to the actual documents when we were working on them, I found, oh man, if I would have known that, I never would have written X. It's not because I was trying to be deceitful when I wrote my dissertation. It's because I didn't know. And so we can't expect people to know things before they know them. That's unfair. In the field of history, people understand that. In the historical field, everyone knows that we could find a treasure trove of George Washington letters tomorrow that changes materially what we think about the Battle of Monmouth. We could. We probably won't. But there's always the possibility. And so I think for Latter-day Saints approaching the idea of seer stones, and they might know someone who's either being antagonistic about it, making fun of it, mocking it, well, don't let that get to you. I mean, that's literally what happened for early Christians. So yeah, Mormonism Unveiled makes fun of seer stones. Yeah. Just like they made fun of the early apostles and early Christians. That doesn't change it. They make fun of the temple ceremony. That doesn't make the temple ceremony not sacred just because some clown is standing wearing temple clothing on the corner, at South Temple when it's time for General Conference. That doesn't change how sacred those things are. Fools mock, but they shall mourn, right? I mean, so that don't allow the mockery of unbelievers to affect the sacred nature of the thing that they're mocking. Any more than you would allow an atheist to mock the resurrection and to let that take away your testimony of the resurrection. So I think that it really, it's something we can embrace. The Book of Mormon is a miracle. I mean, anyone who reads it and then also reads Joseph Smith's other writings from the time period is well aware that this is beyond Joseph's capabilities, which is exactly what Emma Smith says. Even though I was involved, it was a marvel to myself as much as it was to anyone else. In some miraculous way, this book came. And so, to your viewers or listeners who really are hung up on whether or not it was a seer stone or the Urim and Thummim, I would say don't be. The most important thing is this is a miracle from God. Now, if you just can't get past the idea, no, there's no possible way he put a stone in a hat. I mean, as a historian, I'm just telling you what the witnesses and sources of translation said. Mm-hmm. If you don't want to believe that's how it's done, that's fine. This is not a test of faith. It's not one of the articles of faith that he had to have put a stone in a hat. It is what all of the historians who've examined the sources say. If you don't want to think of it that way, you don't have to. What we do have to do is maintain the miraculous, divine nature of the words of the book. That's what matters. And so hopefully that's what people take away from it.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Okay, I'm sorry I've talked way too much.
No, this is fantastic. I've been fascinated, so thank you. Last question. After Joseph died, you told us that the brownstone went with Phineas Young back east. What happened to the other stones that Joseph is reported to have had?
So that's a great question. So there's also there's a really hard way to describe this. You can always tell when a historian's trying to think of how to say something that has bad sourcing, because you're like, how do I say this and not say it in a way that upsets anyone? There are multiple accounts of Joseph also possessing a green seer stone. Now, the problem is, unlike the brown stone and unlike the white stone, where we have multiple contemporary accounts of people seeing them, right? So contemporary meaning people at the time saw them. Wilford Woodruff saw a stone, right? He saw it. He wrote about it in his journal. He's not telling you, he's not telling you in 1880, I saw it. In his journal, he's writing, I saw the Urim and Thummim. He's writing it. Mm-hmm. With the green stone, our earliest reference to it is 1873.
Oh, okay.
And from a Palmyra resident. Now, I don't want to upset anyone who's listening or watching if you happen to be from a certain Latter-day Saint family, but there's a certain Latter-day Saint family in Utah that there was a family tradition associated with the fact that they possessed this green stone, and that it was eventually came back into the possession of the church. We don't have contemporary records of that. And so the earliest we get of the family tradition of this being possessed is actually in the 1930s. So it's very late. Now, that doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, it's always tough when you're dealing with family history stuff. Is it possible that this is one of the stones that Joseph possessed? Yes. Where its whereabouts now? Well, we're actually, frankly, a little unsure. Okay. It was purchased from a museum, and it's possibly is in possession of the church now. We don't know. Okay. The brown stone, not only do we know that it's in the possession of the church, the First Presidency allowed for the photographing of it. It was published in the 2015 in the Ensign magazine. And that one we know is in the First Presidency vault. It's assumed, but not stated, that the white stone is also in the possession of the First Presidency.
Now, is that the one that Wilford Woodruff took to the Manti Temple?
Probably. So here's the reference. When the Manti Temple is being dedicated, on two separate occasions in his journal, Wilford Woodruff does something that is, I don't know how really to describe it, but it is from his journal. So I'll just tell you what he says. On two separate occasions, he says that he consecrates the seer stone on the altar of the temple. Now, the one time is a little bit less known because he writes that in shorthand. And so it's in shorthand in his journal. But in longhand, he sets apart the temple presidency for the Manti Temple. And the next day he writes in his journal, I consecrated upon the altar the seer stone that Joseph Smith found. And several scholars like Dr. McKay and Dr. Frederick have asserted that it's most likely that the stone he's consecrating on the altar of the temple is the white stone, because Wilford Woodruff says it's the stone that he carried, that Joseph carried with him throughout his life.
Okay.
Now, Woodruff, of course, saw the stone in December of 1841. At this point, they do have the other brown stone. So it's totally possible, because here's what I don't know. I don't know if Wilford Woodruff knows the entire, provenance of the brown seer stone. I don't know that Wilford Woodruff was like, oh yes, and then Joseph gave it to him on this day, and then we got that's what historians know, because that's what we're looking for. But on your average everyday life, maybe he's not fully aware of when Oliver had it and when he got it. I mean, Joseph's not making public announcements of, I gave the brown stone to Oliver Cowdery on November of 1820. He's not doing that. Mm-hmm. So it's possible that it's the brown stone that he's consecrating on the altar. But for our purposes, especially to the question of people, Latter-day Saints, who are saying, now, wait a minute, he didn't have another stone. Well, Wilford Woodruff's pretty certain that he does, to the point that he's consecrating it on the altar of the Manti Temple. And I would say, yes, most likely. I mean, for me, if you were to ask me, I would say, yes, it's the white stone. Mm-hmm. However, there is still the possibility that when Wilford says it's the one Joseph carried without him through his life, that what he means is in Joseph's earlier life. And, okay. and I don't know that, but I would say it's most likely that white stone. And really, I mean, again, your listeners can go to wilfordwoodruffpapers.org and you can type in Urim and Thummim and type in seer stone into the search. And both Wilford Woodruff seeing the seer stone in 1841 and then him consecrating it on the altar of the Manti Temple, you can read it right from his journal. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we really need to be careful when we make categorical statements that Joseph Smith never used seer stones and Joseph Smith never had seer stones. And the reason why is we have prophets, in fact, Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff, who are categorically stating that Joseph did have seer stones and did use them. So I feel uncomfortable then saying, well, no, he didn't. Because, I don't think Wilford Woodruff's making a mistake when he's placing that stone on the altar of the Manti Temple. To him, it's an important thing. And again, this shouldn't be the deciding factor in whether or not someone has faith in the Book of Mormon. The words of the Book of Mormon and the Holy Spirit should be the reason why someone believes. But if we're talking about what are the historical sources, we need to make sure we actually look at all the historical sources. Someone might say, and it's a very fair criticism, that Joseph does not himself say, I took a separate seer stone and I placed it in a hat and that's how I translated.
Right.
He doesn't do that. Now, he doesn't tell us how he translated at all. So, I mean, you don't want to make your primary argument from the absence of evidence, because when you say, well, we don't have that, well, yeah, we didn't have the account from the Shaker's journal until we found it, right? So you don't want to make your primary argument on the basis of, well, Joseph never said this, so therefore it didn't happen. Instead, what you have is Joseph saying that it was through the gift and power of God. He is certainly highlighting that it is through the seer stones. In fact, Joseph will revise Doctrine and Covenants sections to put Urim and Thummim in it after their first publication, so that people know the Book of Mormon is translated by the means of the Urim and Thummim, as he says in the Elders' Journal, by the medium of the Urim and Thummim, as he says in the Wentworth letter, through the medium of the Urim and Thummim. So Joseph is very adamant that he uses stones to translate the book. In fact, you'll sometimes have people say, well, didn't Joseph get to the point where he didn't need the stones to translate anymore? We don't have any records of that. There are no sources. There aren't even any bad sources where people say that Joseph got to the point where he just translated the Book of Mormon without using the seer stones. I mean, we do have sources that say, we have a source that says Orson Pratt had a conversation with Joseph when Joseph was translating the Bible. So not the Book of Mormon, the Bible, which was a multi-year effort. So I don't know exactly when this conversation took place. And Orson Pratt is giving this account in Utah many years later. And he says, I asked Joseph why he didn't use the Urim and Thummim to translate the Bible when he'd used it for the Book of Mormon. So the very question that Pratt is asking is premised upon the fact that the reason why I'm asking is you don't appear to be using this for the Bible translation, but you did use it for the Book of Mormon. Right. So in reality, Pratt's question actually solidifies the Book of Mormon translation as being done with the stones. The whole reason he's asking is you use stones for the Book of Mormon, but you're not using it here. But I think it's very difficult to categorically say he used them at this point, he stopped using them at this point, because he's still talking about stones in late Nauvoo. It's become a part of his theology of what the celestial kingdom is going to be like. He's still, when they receive Doctrine and Covenants section 132, and Hiram says, because this is the one on plural marriage, and Hiram says, well, should you receive that through the seer stone? That's kind of an odd question for Hiram to ask, if in fact Joseph's not ever using seer stones at all. And Joseph's response is, well, I already have it all memorized, so I don't need to. I don't need to again. I can write it all right now. But the very fact that he's showing those stones, or a stone, to Wilford Woodruff and to the other quorum of the 12 members is what Brigham Young says, that he's using the seer stones to see Fox's Martyrs and Fox's Book of the Martyrs, that he's using them to receive revelation, at least at time with D&C 34, that he's possibly, or at least according to Wilford Woodruff, using them in the translation of the Book of Abraham. What this really suggests is that these sacred stones are a lifelong part of Joseph Smith and his prophetic mission, rather than just something that was at the very beginning and then gone.
Okay. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I had so much fun.
I feel like I talked way too much.
No, I loved every minute of it. I thought it was great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. And again, I hope that the number one takeaway for everybody is that whether or not the Book of Mormon is the Word of God is something that can only be determined through the Holy Spirit. And whether it's a miracle through one stone or two stones, whether there's a hat or no hat, whether he's looking at the plates or not looking at the plates, the words of the book are the determining factor of whether or not this is a miracle. And obviously, as a believer, I'm someone who's certain that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God. And the historical minutia of trying to figure out how a miracle took place hopefully doesn't ever cloud the fact that a miracle took place. I may not be able to describe how Jesus walked on water, but that Jesus walked on water, I don't want to lose because I can't figure out how to explain it. So
that is very well said. And thank you so very much
thanks for having
joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome.